Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3.4. I've entitled this video, The Southern Colonies. This is the last video of chapter 3. This video is going to cover pages 73 to 77. Virginia and Maryland. The settlement of Jamestown marked the beginning of English colonization in North America and of the Virginia colony. After its difficult beginnings, Virginia began to grow. The demand for workers was high. It took a great deal of labor to plant, tend, and harvest the tobacco crop on which the colony depended. To meet this need for labor, white landowners forced enslaved Africans to work in the tobacco fields. The first group of 20 Africans arrived in 1619 aboard a Dutch trading vessel. In the years to follow, many more ships carrying enslaved humans would arrive in North America. You will learn more about this terrible trade in enslaved Africans in other chapters. So now we can answer question 1. Why was the demand for workers so high in the colony of Virginia in the early 1600s? Well, the demand was high because tobacco was the crop that was making them money, and it took a lot of work, a lot of labor to plant the tobacco, to keep it going, and to harvest it. It took a lot of hours of labor, and they decided that would be the way they would go to do it. And that's question 2. What terrible and tragic habit did colonists begin to rely on in the year 1619? The terrible habit of using slave labor to get them to harvest the crops that were often grown on plantations, especially in the South. The story of Virginia's first Africans shows that not all people came to work in the colonies of their own free will. England also shipped criminals and prisoners of war to the colonies. They could earn their release by working for a period of time, usually 7 years. Many people also came to the colonies as indentured servants. To pay for their passage to America, they agreed to work without pay for a certain length of time. And now we can answer question number 3. Besides enslaved persons, what other groups of people came to work in the colonies not on their own free will? Criminals and prisoners of war. Question number 4. What was an indentured servant? Well, in the back of the book it says as follows. An indentured servant is a laborer who agrees to work without pay for a certain period of time in exchange for passage to America. So basically people that took out a loan, if you will, they couldn't afford the trip to America, so they said, I will work for you for a certain period of time, and then at the end of that time, I will have earned my freedom, so to speak, and I will no longer work for you, and then I will be an American and have my own life. Founding Maryland. Maryland arose from the dream of Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. Calvert wanted a safe place for his fellow Catholics who faced persecution in England. England's King Charles I gave Calvert a proprietary colony north of Virginia. Soon after receiving this grant, Calvert died. His son Cecilius inherited the colony and named it Maryland. Cecilius sent 2 of his brothers to start the colony. They reached America in 1634. Cecilius gave large estates to English aristocrats. He also granted smaller pieces of land to other settlers. As the number of plantations grew, so did the need for workers. The colony imported indentured servants and enslaved Africans. So now we can answer question 5. What did Sir George Calvert want to make the colony of Maryland? He wanted to make it a safe place for his fellow Catholics who were looking to avoid the persecution in England. So he wanted to make it a safe place for Catholics to go to practice their faith without fear of being picked on. Question 6. What is an estate? On the back of the book it describes an estate as a large area of land that has one owner. Question 7. What is a plantation? In the back of the book, a plantation is described as a large farm. So yeah, when you think about plantations, you think about those big farms in the South where a lot of the crops we'll be talking about that use slave labor, like tobacco and cotton and indigo and rice, those were grown on those large plantations. Question number 8. Sorry about that. What people were brought to Maryland to work on the plantations and estates? They brought in indentured servants and enslaved Africans. For years, the Calvert and Penn families argued over the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania. In the 1760s, they hired two men named Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to map the boundary between the colonies. This boundary line became known as the Mason-Dixon line. And here you can see the Mason-Dixon line that separates Maryland from Pennsylvania. Now, this is going to separate those two states, but eventually it's going to have a much bigger connection to American history. I'll give you a little hint. North of that line will be free, south of this line will be slave. Religion was another source of conflict. The Calverts welcomed Protestants as well as Catholics. Protestant settlers outnumbered Catholics. To protect Catholics, the colony established the Act of Toleration in 1649. The act ensured Protestants and Catholics the right to worship freely. Tensions, however, continued. In 1692, Maryland, now a royal colony, established an official Protestant church. As a result, Catholics faced the same restrictions they had in England. Now we can answer a couple of questions. Number 9. What is the Mason-Dixon line? Well, that is the boundary line that separates the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Maryland. And that was used to do that, but also it will eventually serve a much bigger purpose when it comes to the free slaves and the slave states when the Civil War is fought. Question number 10. What was the purpose of the Act of Toleration? Well, the purpose was to give Maryland a place where both Protestants and Catholics could worship freely without fear of prosecution. Rebellion in Virginia. Virginia also experienced conflict. As the colony grew, settlers moved west and on two Native American lands. In the 1640s, Virginia Governor William Berkeley made a pledge to Native Americans. In exchange for a large piece of land, he agreed to keep settlers from pushing farther into their territory. Berkeley's goal was to prevent the outbreak of a war with the Native Americans. Nathaniel Bacon was a young planter in western Virginia. He opposed the colonial government because it was dominated by Easterners. Many Westerners also resented Berkeley's pledge to stay out of Native American territory. Some settled in the forbidden areas. They then blamed the government for not clearing the colony of Native Americans. In 1676, Bacon led attacks on Native American villages. His army also marched to Jamestown to drive out Berkeley, and they burned the town to the ground. Bacon seemed on the verge of taking over the colony when he suddenly became ill and died. With his death, the rebellion faded. England recalled Berkeley and sent troops to restore order. Bacon's rebellion showed that government could not ignore the demands of its people. And now we can answer a couple of questions. Question number 11. What deal did the governor William Berkeley make in the 1640s with Native Americans? He said, look, I don't want conflict with you. You give me a piece of land, and we will stop pushing further into your territory. That would be the same deal that settlers made with Native Americans over and over and over again in our country's history, and we would break it every time. Question number 12. Why were planters in Western Virginia, such as Nathaniel Bacon, upset at the colonial government? Well, they felt like the government wasn't looking out for their needs. They felt like the government had made a deal with the Native Americans and they had enriched their pockets while they, these Western settlers, felt like they weren't being supported by the government. So they were very angry about that. Question number 13. Summarize Bacon's rebellion. Well, Bacon took that anger and he got a group of people to join him and they went around, they attacked Native American villages, then they went to Jamestown and they drove out Berkeley, and then they burned the town to the ground, and it looked like all would be lost, and then Bacon died. Question number 14. What did Bacon's rebellion demonstrate about the colonists living in America at that time? It showed that the colonists did not want to be ignored, and that they would take up arms if they felt like they were being ignored by the government. A little prelude to the American Revolutionary War. The Carolinas and Georgia. In 1663, King Charles II created a proprietary colony south of Virginia called Carolina, Latin for Charles's land. The king gave the colony to 8 nobles. The proprietors set up estates and sold or rented land to settlers brought from England. John Locke, an English philosopher, wrote a Constitution, a plan that outlined the jobs and powers of the colony's government. The Constitution covered topics such as land divisions and social rank. Locke stated, quote, "Every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands are properly his." And now we can answer a couple of questions. Question 15. What colony was set up south of Virginia in 1663? And that would be Carolina. Question 16. What is a constitution? Well, back in the textbook, the back where it has the definitions, it defines a constitution as such: a detailed written plan for a government, or a lot of basic laws that support a government. That is a constitution. 2 Carolinas. Carolina did not develop as planned. It split into northern and southern Carolina. Farmers from inland Virginia settled northern Carolina. They grew tobacco, pictured here, and sold timber and tar. Northern Carolina lacked a good harbor, so farmers used Virginia's ports. Settlers in southern Carolina took advantage of fertile land and the harbor at Charlestown, later Charleston. Settlements there spread, and trade in deerskin, lumber, and beef thrived. 2 crops came to dominate Carolina agriculture. In the 1680s, planters discovered that rice, shown here, grew well in the wet coastal lowlands. Growing rice required much labor, and the demand for slave labor rose. Another important crop was indigo, pictured over here. A young English woman named Eliza Lucas developed this crop in the 1640s. Indigo, a blue flowering plant, was used to dye cloth. By the early 1700s, Carolina settlers were growing tired of proprietary rule. In 1719, settlers in southern Carolina took control from their proprietors. In 1729, Carolina became 2 royal colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. So now we can answer a couple of questions. Question 17. What crop grew well in the wet coastal lowlands of Carolina? That crop was rice. Question 18. Why did rice cause the demand for slave labor to increase in America? Well, growing rice took a lot of labor, and so they had already gotten into this habit of using slave labor, and so they just extended that out to growing rice. Question 19. Another important crop was indigo. What is indigo? That is a blue flowering plant that was grown to dye cloth. So now you could make clothes that had blue in them. Question 20. What happened to Carolina in 1729? It became 2 separate colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. Georgia. Georgia, founded in 1733, was the last British colony set up in America. James Oglethorpe received a charter from George II for a colony where debtors and poor people could make a fresh start. In Britain, debtors, those who had debts, could be imprisoned if they were unable to pay what they owed. The British also hoped Georgia would block any Spanish attack on the colonies from Florida. Oglethorpe and his settlers built the forts and town of Savannah to discourage such attacks. Georgia did not develop as Oglethorpe planned. Hundreds of poor people came from Britain, but few debtors settled there. Religious refugees from Central Europe and a small group of Jews also arrived. Many settlers complained about Oglethorpe's rules, especially the limits on land holding and the ban on slave labor and rum. A frustrated Oglethorpe finally agreed to their demands. Disappointed with the colony's slow growth, he gave up and turned Georgia over to the king in 1751. By that time, the British had been in eastern North America for almost 150 years. They had lined the Atlantic coast with colonies. And now we can finish up with some questions. 21. What did James Oglethorpe originally want to make the colony of Georgia? He wanted to make it a place where people who had been given a tough lot in life, those who were poor and those who were in debt, he wanted to give them a fresh start so they could live free from that debt or from that lack of money. Because back then, to be in debt could put you in prison. And think about that. How are you supposed to pay back your debt if you're in prison? So it became sometimes a life-term sentence for some people. And so he wanted to give these people a fresh start. So it was a very good intention that Oglethorpe originally had. Question 22. What military strategic value did the British see in the colony of Georgia? Well, they were hoping that by having Georgia as a colony, they could have forts built here and that would protect the rest of their colonies from the Spanish who had settled in Florida. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I have not one, but two memes today. Number one, you know you're from Maryland when it's no big deal to get lost and end up in another state. And secondly, when you realize that Bacon's rebellion wasn't edible. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.